Thank you very much, Johanna. That was wonderful. We're now going to shift to the question and answer portion of our discussion. So you've all got cards that you can write your questions on. I will start with one question to get us going, and then we'll move to the audience questions. It seems to me there are two main cases one can make for integrated schools. There's the one based on test scores and academic achievement, and it's one that many of us have been making for years, that low-income kids in middle-class schools are 2 years ahead of low-income kids in high-poverty schools, and that African-American students, Latino students are doing better in integrated schools than they are in segregated schools. But Randy, you mentioned democracy. Oh, okay. True to form. Good. Randy mentioned democracy, and Secretary King, that was a major theme of your during your time as Secretary of Education as well. And I'm wondering whether, in the environment we find ourselves in, whether advocates of school integration should be emphasizing that piece, that our democracy is in trouble, that we've elected as president an individual who ran against democratic values that had been embraced by Republicans and Democrats alike for many years, and got away with it. 25% of young people say that democracy is a bad or very bad system of government. And Cliff Janey and I have argued that we're kind of in this, there's a Sputnik moment for civics education, given what we've seen, and that the implicit curriculum that one receives in a segregated environment can feed into our crisis. So I'm wondering if your thoughts on that question, whether we should, as advocates of integration, should we be emphasizing the democracy piece, the academic achievement piece, and I won't let you say both. That's too easy.
It's going to be hard to answer that saying both, but I think we should be emphasizing the democracy piece, and I think there is a realization that so many of the challenges we face around issues of race have their foundation in folks not being exposed to each other, right? If your first interaction, your first cross-racial interaction is at a police stop, that's going to end up very badly, right? And so we can't separate out the things that we're seeing around policing reform from the issues that begin in school communities that are highly segregated. And so I do think there's an opportunity to leverage the democracy argument, but it has to be a sense of a democracy that is grounded in a broader community. And there is a risk. And there was a recent story about the trend around the country that is emerging of secession by communities from their neighbors in order to produce schools that are actually more segregated by race and class. And that's being done in a democratic way if what you mean is people voting or the vote of a school board. But I think democracy is also about a broader sense of community, a broader notion that we are somehow responsible for each other. That sort of sense of mutual obligation that is also at the heart of democracy. And so I think we've got to appeal to that broader notion, where we risk seeing a intensification of that trend towards folks isolating themselves.
We did a survey and worked with the community of Louisville, Jefferson County, Kentucky, and helping them figure out a way to remain integrated after the Supreme Court struck down their deseg plan. And the parents involved decision in 2007. We surveyed the students. Louisville's been integrated city and suburbs now for ever since 1975, for more than 40 years. And they like it. The students and their parents both said they are comfortable working with and discussing issues across racial and ethnic lines and working under leadership of a different race, and comfortable in interracial settings. And employers and the mayor of Louisville actually went into the court and testified for this, that they actually have a community where people communicate much more comfortably across racial and ethnic lines because they were raised in that kind of setting. You know, John Dewey was right in some important ways. We really need to make this possible. We do know that students who are in schools that are diverse, particularly schools that have equitable policies for the diversity, do develop more positive interracial attitudes and understandings. Teachers also prefer to be in these schools. We did a survey of teachers across the country. Teachers really like to be in and are committed to staying in integrated schools where they leave resegregated and highly impoverished schools pretty systematically as they develop seniority. So we have to think about this on a number of dimensions, but we also need to think about curriculum. I was in a school in Connecticut that was a statewide winner in math and reading scores, even though it was extremely high poverty. And I sat down with the principal at lunch and I said to him, "You guys have amazing scores. I'm a political scientist. What are you teaching the kids about our democracy?" And he said to me, "Nothing. It isn't on the test." And I thought, you know, that's wrong. Just to emphasize math and reading, our schools were created to make a democracy workable. One of the things they have to do to make our democracy workable with no racial majority group is to deal with the issue of race and separation, stereotypes, and so forth. And that people need to have that be part of their curriculum, explicitly and implicitly.
Yeah, I would just add that I think emphasizing the civic goals is important because in some ways it does allow me to answer both, because I think if you're sort of emphasizing the benefits of understanding sort of democracy and citizenship, that automatically I think leads to a better understanding of thinking about and assessing, you know, equal opportunity in our country, which sort of leads to those achievement goals. I also think emphasizing the sort of civics and citizenship and democracy side of things may also appeal to a wider sort of constituency. As we mentioned, there is support among white and higher income families for integration, but this is something where you can sort of directly say, you know, it's sort of an instrumental strategy to say, like, your kid will benefit from this when, you know, little darling, you know, Johnny is CEO of some multinational corporation. Like, this is an important skill for him to have. So in some ways, it's like a strategic sort of appealing to a broader constituency.
I would say democracy and building up citizenship. I see that every day. Students come with socio-emotional needs that they need to have addressed, and then they become adults eventually, and they need to have an opportunity to engage with others. And how do they learn that? The only way is through our schools. So, yep.
So there's a very large number of excellent questions. So you don't each need to feel compelled to answer every one of them. But if you want to, that's fine as well. So Secretary King mentioned that the former superintendent of Montgomery County, Josh Starr, is here. He's got a question. How can the integration movement be reconciled with the choice movement? The former sees schools as a public good, and the latter sees them as a private commodity. Is there a middle ground? And I think, Josh, we were talking about a possible middle ground in Montgomery County using public school choice, but what do you all think of that?
Yeah, a couple things. One is I distinguish between vouchers and public school choice. I think they're entirely different. The notion of public schools that are publicly funded and publicly accountable, to me, is a very different thing from schools that are private schools that are taking dollars out of the public system and that are not accountable to public authority, and as was illustrated yesterday, less accountable to civil rights protections. So once we're talking about a public school choice context, I think we've got to be smart about the choice design, and the design matters a lot. Whether you have a design that encourages socioeconomic and racial integration matters a lot. You know, there's an intentionality that a community can have. I mentioned the example of Cambridge, where socioeconomic status weighs in how they run their choice system. You can be quite intentional in saying we're going to set up a choice system that has folks rank their preferences, but then we're going to control for a degree of socioeconomic diversity in our schools because we care about that. You can also make choices that are going to attract kids from diverse districts or diverse neighborhoods. And Gary's point about his granddaughter's dual language program, I think, illustrates that very well. The key thing, though, I think we all have to acknowledge is that parents are going to look for something for their kids. And so while I do think we should elevate the democracy argument, I think it'd be naive to think that parents are going to say, I'm going to send my kid to a school that I think is bad for my kid in service of some broader purpose. I think that is not a good strategy on our part. We got to make sure that the schools are all schools that folks would want to choose. They may be different, an emphasis on STEM or an emphasis on writing, and going through the Montgomery County school choice process myself with my daughters, it matters to them. You know, my younger daughter's super excited about STEM, and that's great. She's still going to learn English and social studies and be prepared to be a good citizen, but she's excited about STEM, and that's appealing to her. My older daughter's very different. She's excited about theater and about writing, and so she's chosen a different choice. The choices are all good, and in too many places, the choices available to low-income folks of color, are not good choices. So that's a problem of design. But the choices are also set up in a way that's going to foster diversity, and that's one of the things I value about how Montgomery County has approached this.
We did a book about this called Educational Delusions. And the basic argument of the book is choice without equity provisions attached makes things worse. It increases stratification. And that's been shown all over the world. Choice with appropriate equity elements can increase opportunity. And the elements were known by the time that the good magnet schools were created in the 1970s. When we first did freedom of choice in the 1960s, it totally failed. But in the 1970s, we learned that you had to have choice for everybody. There had to be rich parent information. There had to be free transportation. There had to be no screening of students in the choice system. There had to be genuinely worthwhile choices, academically worthwhile alternatives. We learned how to do that, and then we forgot it. And you know, I'm just talking to somebody yesterday from Alabama who said all of the choice magnet schools now have tests, admissions tests. That undermines and guarantees stratification. You know, it is a guarantee that the choice will increase social inequality because who makes the tests, who can provide their own transportation and so forth, is dramatically class related. So we have to think about choice as something that can either make things worse or make it better. The reason that charter schools by and large are more segregated than public schools is that they don't have most of those equity provisions. We should add them to charter schools if we're going to be really committed to charter schools, and we should add them to vouchers if we're going to do vouchers. If we don't have them, it's predictable what will happen.
I'll just add on. Chicago has one hybrid, Gary, you know, where they do have test schools, schools you have to test into, but then they have a component, an equity component in it as well that says if you're from a disadvantaged neighborhood, you have a different, they make sure that there's equitable distribution among the different groups. What states are utilizing SOL in to push for school integration? What are they doing, and how can other states follow those steps?
That depends on what people in this room do going forward, right? Well, I think the reality is most states have not addressed, not most states, all states to date have not made this a focus of their ESSA work. To my knowledge, New York's the only state that has a history of using school improvement dollars for this purpose. But the flexibility in the law does allow states to prioritize this work. But they need to hear from the advocacy community, whether it's civil rights groups or business groups or educator groups or parent groups, that it's something that people value. And the risk is if they don't hear that, they will go in the wrong direction. I mean, Gary talked about Louisville, Kentucky. One of the shocking of political developments in an era of many shocking political developments was the state legislature in Kentucky, ostensibly folks who campaigned themselves on local control, seeming like they were poised to undo Louisville's voluntary school integration strategy by overriding it with a state law that would override the local control in Louisville. It was shocking. Now, fortunately, lots of advocates weighed in, and that effort stalled in the state legislature in Kentucky. But I think if we aren't insisting that states take up this issue, they won't. And there's still an opportunity. The majority of states have not submitted their Every Student Succeeds Act plans yet. They are in process. There's an opportunity for everyone in this room, wherever you're from, wherever your organizations are working, to weigh in on those plans and say that at least has to be a part of how they think about the school improvement work.
We've got another question, provocative question here. How do we confront the negative perception some in the Black community have about the usefulness of Brown versus Board of Education, and the idea that there's nothing wrong with an all-Black, high-quality neighborhood school? You don't all jump in at once.
Nobody wants to be the first.
Well, one thing I would say is, while it's certainly possible that there are high quality majority or entirely Black or entirely Hispanic schools, we know there. I was speaking to someone in Colorado who was talking to me about a network of charter schools. I think that's 99% Latino and producing extraordinary gains. And he was kind of saying, well, why do we have to give up some seats for white kids just to achieve integration when we're doing sort of great work for this Latino community? And I'm sympathetic to that position. I think my concern would be, systemically across districts, across schools, we have pretty good evidence that generally separate but equal or separate but superior doesn't happen sort of systemically. And so I think for me, it comes down to, yes, there's certainly cases where there's, benefits in these types of schools. From a systemic level, it would just make me nervous to sort of say, oh, I'm sure separate but equal will work out, because we know that it hasn't. So
I've been asked this question 1,000 times, I think. But basically, one of the things I always say is I do not know any integrationists who don't support high-quality schools in every neighborhood under all conditions. We believe there ought to be resources for them. And I don't know any who don't reward and celebrate when there's a great all-minority school that gets high test scores. That's terrific. And it's nothing magical about sitting next to white children. But being in a middle-class school that's connected to colleges and has the right curriculum and has the right connections and the networks that lead you to college and jobs is a tremendous advantage. It would be an advantage for white kids if we had concentrated white poverty. It would be in an upper middle-class Black school. That's true. And I mean, and of course, we'd be in a different society if there were a lot of schools like that out there. But you don't have to choose. People who believe in integration also believe in school improvement and don't think integration is going to solve the whole problem by itself in any reasonable, simple future. So most of the people who are in this movement believe in doing both of these things to the maximum extent they can possibly be done. And most of the people who say you have to make a choice don't believe in doing either of them.
I think I agree with Ann and Gary completely. The one thing I would add is I think we have to be honest about some of what has taken place in badly implemented integration efforts. And two things stand out to me. One is a lot of African American teachers lost jobs in communities around the country because racism is like water. It finds the cracks wherever they are. And so folks responded to integration in some communities by saying, okay, we'll integrate the schools, but we will let go of the African American teachers. And so that we have to acknowledge that that happened, that that had a consequence, and that is a fear that folks have, that what will happen in schools is that the African American community will lose representation and voice in the faculty and the leadership and the governance. So we just have to acknowledge that that has been a problem. And it's why the equity provisions need to be present in whatever approach we take. Second, we have to acknowledge that there are schools where the students may be integrated or diverse at the doorway, but inside of the school, students are not getting equitable access to opportunities, and people are right to be mad about that, right? So it is true, Gary's point is exactly right. If African American Latino students are, and low income students are more likely to attend schools where you can't even take AP classes or physics or chemistry or algebra 2. But we all, probably in this room, have been in schools where you can walk down the hallway and on one side of the hall are the kids who are in the AP class, and the other side of the hall are the kids who are not. And the main difference between them is that the white kids are in the AP class and the African American kids and Latino kids are not. And so when you see that happen in schools, that also makes you question whether or not this is a movement that will be truly beneficial. And we also have to acknowledge that disproportionate discipline is taking place in schools. That is not just a problem in schools of concentrated poverty or racially isolated schools. There is an issue of implicit bias that comes with being an American and growing up in our society. But when you see that implicit bias play out in a way that means that kids of color are disproportionately disciplined in an integrated school setting, that's another reason that makes you skeptical about the effort. So I think it's important for all of us to confront those things and say, we're against those. We need to have equity provisions in how we do diverse schools. And we have to acknowledge in the communities that we celebrate for their diversity that they are struggling, many of them, with these issues. That it's not all tidy, and we got to be champions of equity in all forms.
I just want to add that I do believe that equity and access are crucial, but also closing like opportunity gap, because I'm from Long Island, and that is one of the most segregated places because you only go to school based on where you live. So districts like Hempstead are predominantly Latino and Black, whereas a neighboring district like Garden City would have more resources. So distributing resources and funding in order to create opportunity and equity and balance would be more favorable in order to.
There are a number of questions about the relationship between schooling and housing. There is research suggesting there is a slow decline in racial segregation by residents and an increase in income segregation. And there's a question here from Cristobal Rodriguez from Howard University. You notice I'm giving extra call-outs to the people who put their names for future events. I don't know if that helps with the moderator, but asks this question: how can local governments create or enhance mixed income housing policies to counter segregation and gentrifying forces?
I mean, I think the first answer is that they definitely can. It's just a matter of, if they choose to. So zoning is a huge cause of segregation. So zoning for multifamily versus single family homes, lower income families tend to not be able to afford, obviously, single family homes. And so that just the sort of zoning and creation of housing stock sort of sets this physical landscape for segregation that then all of our social processes get laid on top of. So zoning's a really big thing. I think when thinking about of those eligible for housing subsidies in the U.S., only about a quarter actually receive them. It's not like food stamps or something else where if you're eligible, you receive them. So I think, assisted housing can move the needle a little bit, in particular placing, actual physical developments in higher income areas rather than assuming that voucher families can somehow magically find the one rental to a home in a high income area can potentially make a difference. And then we know that things like racial discrimination still occur in housing search processes, lending processes, all of that. So those are things that local governments can't do, but that and sort of our larger economic inequality forces are important too. But I think on the local level, yeah, there's zoning choices that are made that are important.
I would just add that, our largest housing subsidy program in the country now is called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. It's oddly enough administered by the United States Treasury Department. They've never had a reasonable civil rights element in that program. We did a study of it in Southern California, and we found out almost all of the housing that's being financed through that now, which involves gigantic tax subsidies, is being located where there's segregated schools. It's just needlessly adding to the problem. And we really don't have any real effort to address this issue. Both in Chicago and in Cambridge, I lived on blocks that had scattered site housing. We had absolutely zero problems. Almost nobody knew it was even there. The people who lived in those units acted just like everybody else in the neighborhood. It was the essence of simplicity in operation. It just seems to me we've used extremely little imagination in our housing development process. Montgomery County is a good example of getting affordable housing added to all large developments. That should be done everywhere in the country. It doesn't hurt the value of housing at all, and it provides housing for people like teachers and lower income workers in your community to actually live in your community.
I just have to jump in on 2 points because I'm a housing nerd, but I'll just say our biggest housing subsidy program is the mortgage income deduction tax, right? We spend 4 times or 5 times, I lose track, as much on that than we do on housing subsidies for the poor. But Gary, you'll be happy to know that there is a federal court case about the low-income housing tax credit and the fact that it prioritizes siting in high-poverty minority communities. That's wending its way. So maybe that'll make a difference.
I know you say we don't have to all weigh in on every question, but I think it's important to say on this issue that the arrow of causality runs in both directions. And I sometimes worry that I've heard elected officials say there's nothing we can do about school segregation because it's all about housing. But in fact, when you have segregated schools, racially and socioeconomically, that incentivizes greater segregation in housing. And so if you look at Central Brooklyn, right, there are parts of Central Brooklyn that are where the schools are more segregated than the housing. But if you look over a 5 to 10 year period, what's happening is that is exacerbating the concentration of wealth in those segregated, affluent white schools. And I worry for DC. You can see that pattern playing out in DC over the next 5 to 10 years unless folks take active steps on both the school side and the housing side.
Okay, good. Here's a question about charter schools from Will from the 21st Century School Fund. In January, DC's mayor prepared a walkability preference, allowing preference in the school lottery for kids living closer to a charter school than their neighborhood DCPS school. What positive or negative effects do you see coming from this and other policies that favor charters over neighborhood schools, especially in cities like DC that are experiencing rapid gentrification?
We did a report on Washington, D.C. You can see all these reports on the Civil Rights Project website. We did it about a few months ago. D.C. is now predominantly non-black for the first time in a half century. But its schools have had very little effect, and the charter school system here, which is huge, and it's all been built since 1990, is even more segregated than the public school system. Very little outreach, the last thing they need is more neighborhood preference. They need to have much more creative use of magnets and other kinds of integration strategies. And the charter schools should be subject, and all the schools of choice should be subject to the kinds of policies that I talked about earlier. DC has a lot of potential, and so do a lot of other areas. There's not a lot of big cities that have massive gentrification, but we're having it in Los Angeles. There's a lot of places where you really have the potential to create substantial diversity and to bring in a lot of people with resources back to the public school system that nothing creative is being done about.
And just to echo Secretary King's last point, there was a recent study showing that in neighborhoods, particularly majority non-white neighborhoods, where charter schools were becoming increasingly available, the sort of odds and pace of gentrification was increasing because it provides white and higher income families moving in a non-neighborhood school option. So it definitely has impacts on both schools and neighborhoods.
Since we're at the Albert Shanker Institute, I'll mention one other thing here on this question of charters. I wrote a biography of Al Shanker, and he was one of the first proponents, as you probably know, Gary, of charter schools, but saw them in a very, very different light than we see many charter schools today. And one of the ideas was that they had the potential to be integrated. You know, he was inspired by his experience in Germany, where you had Turkish immigrant students sitting next to German native students. And a charter school, because it was a school of choice, could bring kids of different backgrounds together. And it's tragic that so few do. There are a small and growing number of diverse by design charter schools, as Secretary King mentioned, but they still remain the minority. Okay, here's another one. This is the last one? Okay. So this will be a last one then. What should communities of color, such as Prince George's County, Maryland, be discussing or looking at around school integration, around race and socioeconomic status? So one way to interpret this is if you have a majority black school district that has socioeconomic diversity within it, is there value to nevertheless pushing for more socioeconomic diversity, even if it doesn't bring a lot of racial diversity?
We found PG County is the most segregated part of metropolitan Washington. I moved here in the early 70s, and I was looking for an integrated neighborhood, of course, and I went out to PG County and looked at housing, and the realtors told me it's not going to be integrated. It's going to be all black, at least out to the Beltway within a few years. And of course it was. I mean, that was what people understood. It was the largest and first really large black suburbanization in the United States. Nothing was done about the integration issues in a serious way. And there's this huge flow of people from DC into PG without any real policy framework. It's late, very late in the game. Usually people ask you in suburban communities for help after about 15 years too late, you know, to really put things into place. But of course, PG has a major university campus, and I would start there thinking about what to do and build out from there in terms of thinking about some creative things to do in maintaining and spreading diversity.
Okay, good. All right, well, wonderful. Well, we had a wonderful opportunity here to hear from a variety of voices, all of them at the same time committed to improving our schools, improving integration, and I, for one, walk away from this very inspired. So thank you all very much.